Just a quick word before we begin. So this video will be discussing the writing of H.P. Lovecraft and how it's inspired Magic the Gathering.
Now, Lovecraft's writing is many things. It was bold, it was grim, it was dark. It was unfortunately often very, very racist. I felt I needed to mention that. I mean, Lovecraft was one of the great writers of the 20th century, and his works inspired a whole genre, but the man was a massive racist, even by the standards of his own time, and I couldn't write a whole video about his ideas and just let that fall to the wayside. Can we separate Lovecraft the racist from Lovecraft the writer? Well, no. No, we can't. They were the same person, and Lovecraft's bigotry very often informed his writing. You can enjoy and appreciate Lovecraft's work, but never let yourself forget the racist mind behind it. In adapting Lovecraft's writings, Wizards of the Coast, and the many others who've taken inspiration from him, need to employ a very delicate hand. His genre-defining presentations of fraying sanity and eldritch monstrosities are kept. His xenophobia is dropped, harshly, into the dustbin of history where it belongs. Through the years, Magic the Gathering sets have drawn inspiration from a variety of sources, including Greek mythology, fairy tales, and the 1001 Arabian Nights, to name just a few examples. But today, we'll be looking at the inspiration which Magic the Gathering has drawn from one specific genre: horror. More specifically, Lovecraftian horror, a genre which was created and defined by Howard Phillips, or H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft's writing is morbid, deep, and dark. It's often centered around themes of madness and the ultimate insignificance of humanity in a vast, alien, and uncaring universe. I feel the essence of Lovecraft's writing is best captured in this quote, which opens The Call of Cthulhu, arguably his most famous work.
The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but some day the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the light into the peace and safety of a new dark age.
So yeah, jolly stuff. But how has Magic the Gathering been influenced by the writings of this incredibly morbid horror author? Well, Lovecraft's works started what became known as the Cthulhu mythos, a term describing a pantheon of malevolent elder gods who, in the works of Lovecraft and his protégés, hold unknowable power and are capable of destroying or consuming the human race with merely a thought. These elder gods became a direct inspiration for the Eldrazi, Magic's biggest and most menacing creatures. Well, apart from Guilds of Ravnica's impervious Great Worm, of course. The Eldrazi were introduced in 2010's Rise of the Eldrazi, appropriately enough, I suppose. This set did Lovecraft's writings proud. The Eldrazi were colourless and had unusual artwork, representing their alien and unknowable nature. They had huge stats, and the absurdly broken Annihilator ability, which demonstrated their awesome power and endless appetite. The Eldrazi debuted impactfully and effectively, setting themselves up as a memorable creature type for years to come. Since their debut in 2010, the Lovecraft-inspired Eldrazi have appeared twice more, first in Battle For Zendikar block, and then in Shadows Over Innistrad block. Battle For Zendikar and Oath of the Gatewatch both failed to properly portray the Eldrazi as the Lovecraftian monstrosities they were designed to be, whilst Shadows Over Innistrad and Eldritch Moon succeeded in making them even more horrifying and alien than they'd been before. This video will analyse how Battle For Zendikar failed and how Shadows Over Innistrad succeeded at telling a Lovecraftian horror story. First, let's look at Battle For Zendikar and how it fails to present the Eldrazi as eldritch monstrosities. Now I'll begin by saying one thing in Battle For Zendikar's defence. Unlike Rise of the Eldrazi and Shadows Over Innistrad, the set wasn't really trying to tell a horror story. As its name would imply, the set was trying to tell a war story, so it's using the Eldrazi as antagonists to fundamentally different effect. Here, they're an enemy army, rather than an inscrutable existential threat. Does this make the set's presentation of the Eldrazi okay? Well, not really.
A Lovecraftian war story doesn't really work. Or at least not one in which the horrifying terrors from the beyond are an army that ultimately gets beaten back and slain. Ancient, unknowable evil can't be bested by hitting it really hard with a sword, or by throwing fireballs at it, or by overwhelming it with cavalry charges. Wizards of the Coast probably should have picked different antagonists if they wanted to make Battle for Zendikar a war story, like the Malakir vampires. Imagine if Battle for Zendikar was still a war story, but one in which the conflict was between two different Zendikari factions. The Eldrazi could remain in the set, but would take on a more thematically appropriate role. Maybe they'd lurk darkly in the background, warping the minds of fighters on both sides to some unknowable end. Maybe they'd simply tear through battlefields unprovoked, their giant forms crushing fighters on both sides with impunity. Now, I'm not arguing this would have been a perfect story, but it would have preserved the threat which the Eldrazi represented in their first appearance in Rise of the Eldrazi. Placing them in the role of an enemy army, and one which loses the war, fundamentally undermines their power to terrify, and their effectiveness as antagonists going forward. So why specifically don't the Eldrazi work when they're forced into the role of an enemy army in a war story? The primary flaw with cramming them into this role is that they're simply no longer intimidating. Rise of the Eldrazi featured only 19 Eldrazi. This kept them as a rare and terrifying presence. As there were so few of them, each printed Eldrazi in the set served a purpose, and solidified their identity as terrifying otherworldly titans. Even the smallest among them, like Nest Invader, bore intimidating names and served a clear purpose, as a generator of spawn who could be offered up in sacrifice to bring out their truly monstrous masters. In contrast, Battle for Zendikar contains 51 Eldrazi. The demand to transform them from a lingering alien presence into a faction meant that a high number of them needed to exist. This meant that not every Eldrazi was effectively able to convey a consistent tone. The Eldrazi were now everywhere, and worse, several of them were weak. Tremble in fear before the scion of an eldritch god which has manifested itself into the mortal realm. Sludge Crawler. 1/1 for 1 black mana that can temporarily buff itself, and sometimes exiles cards from atop of your opponent's library. Terrifying. Regrettably, even the name doesn't sound intimidating. A sludge crawler doesn't sound like an otherworldly horror, it's a sweaty weirdo in a nightclub. To give credit where credit's due though, the artwork on the Eldrazi of Battle for Zendikar remained fantastic, and perfectly captures everything horrifying and alien about them. Unthreatening though its name and stats may be, Sludge Crawler looks like a twisted amalgamation of a human and a leech. The trailing arms on its front side are paralleled by the grasping tendrils on its back, and its blank, expressionless face, which emerges from a contorted mouth-like protrusion in its torso, is honestly incredibly eerie. So thanks Johan Vodin, and thanks to all of Magic's artists, who are doing as fantastic a job in Battle for Zendikar as they do in each and every set. Although their art design was on point, the mechanical execution of the Eldrazi in Battle for Zendikar block was strange. They were given two signature mechanics, Devoid and Ingest. The Devoid mechanic manages to be both a hit and a miss at conveying the alien nature of the Eldrazi. Devoid is a mechanic which makes Eldrazi count as colourless, even when they require coloured mana to play. This is another product of the need to print so many Eldrazi to fill out the set. It would have been impossible to put 51 colourless Eldrazi in the set, or at least, it would have made the set play incredibly strangely and limited. Devoid was made to circumvent this issue, by retaining their colourless identity, even though the cards cost coloured mana. Mechanically, Devoid is largely regarded as a failure. It's called a do-nothing mechanic, and it's accused of often having no real impact on gameplay. I would argue that Devoid is judged marginally too harshly, and that it's very good at conveying the Eldrazi's alien and contradictory nature. Devoid cards have all the hallmarks of being a coloured card, but are actually colourless, making them weird and unique, which I think was exactly the desired effect. Also, within Limited, there were several ways of making Devoid matter, even if an individual card possessing the mechanic doesn't matter in a vacuum. Nevertheless, the mechanic's unpopularity makes it clear that this ambiance was bought at the price of cramming a practically functionless mechanic
onto many creatures and spells.
Ingest was another odd mechanic. When a creature with Ingest damages an opponent, that player is forced to exile the top card of their library. Once again, this mechanic was criticised for being a do-nothing mechanic. Although there were some Eldrazi from the set, such as Oracle of Dust and Murkstrider, who were capable of interacting with these exiled cards to grant you positive effects, for the most part, Ingest just worked as a very, very slow and impractical means of milling an opponent. It was clear what Ingest was trying to convey, however. In Rise of the Eldrazi, Annihilator had been used to show the Eldrazi's insatiable hunger. They'd tear off and consume your opponent's permanents, even if those permanents were abstract things like enchantments, all in the name of appeasing their insatiable appetite. Of course, Annihilator was deemed too powerful a mechanic to make a return, and another means was sought of conveying the Eldrazi's ceaseless hunger. Enter Ingest. Again, I feel this mechanic works narratively. The card exile from atop your opponent's library represents your Eldrazi feasting on your opponent's thoughts and sanity, but it fails in gameplay. Like Devoid, Ingest simply doesn't accomplish enough to warrant its presence on so many cards. The final flaw in using the Eldrazi as the antagonist in Battle for Zendikar block was that the set resolved with a happy ending. As depicted in the artwork of the cards Bonds of Mortality and Fall of the Titans, the Eldrazi Titans Kozilek and Ulamog, basically the two leaders of their factions during the Battle for Zendikar, were bound into the plane through its ley line network and then incinerated. Zendikar proved resurgent, and everything ended happily ever after, aside from the fact that Ugin was a bit cross with the Gatewatch. Now, I don't want to sound overly gloomy. After all, most stories have happy endings, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But an ending this unambiguously happy shouldn't be happening in a story which features creatures inspired by Lovecraftian horror. The Eldrazi twisted the geography of Zendikar, mentally scarred its inhabitants, and reshaped reality to their whims. These are not the sort of villains to be burned away with fireballs and forgotten about overnight. I hope I've demonstrated at this stage that the Eldrazi were not utilised to their fullest potential as antagonists in the Battle for Zendikar block. They were shoehorned into being the baddies in a war story, a role which suited them poorly.
Just look at how many cards from a set depict these horrifying monstrosities being defeated, humbled, or humiliated, dramatically undermining their ability to terrify and to shock.
The abundance of them that needed to be printed to make the set work stripped them of their identity, and forced wizards to use the Void to balance them, a flavourful but unpopular mechanic, along with Ingest. The fact that the Eldrazi were vanquished through the power of teamwork, and that everything ended up unambiguously happy ever after once they were gone, demonstrates that though the Eldrazi were designed as Lovecraftian horrors, they were now being cast in a far lighter story of a different genre. After Oath of the Gatewatch, I felt a bit frustrated with Magic the Gathering's story. It seemed to me that Wizards of the Coast had wasted the potential of a potentially intriguing set of villains, and that the opportunity to see Lovecraftian horror in Magic the Gathering had decisively passed. Little did I know, the very next block coming along would execute Lovecraftian storytelling masterfully, telling a narrative through all aspects of the card's artwork, flavour and mechanics that perfectly conveyed the conventions of Lovecraftian horror. I am, of course, talking about the Shadow Over Innsmouth block. Shadows Over Innistrad block. Innistrad is Magic the Gathering's horror plane. On our visit to the plane in 2011, we saw references to all manner of horror stories. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Exorcist, and The Fly. But during our return to the plane in 2016, we began, not with horror, but with an investigation. Something strange was happening on Innistrad. Its populace were being driven mad by some mysterious force. Most notably, Avacyn and the flights of angels serving her had stopped protecting humanity and were now violently purging them instead. The investigation into the source of this madness is represented by the
Investigate mechanic, and the clue tokens used throughout the set.
Investigation is a common theme in Lovecraft's works. Usually the protagonists are troubled by something and begin to look for an answer. In doing so, they dig too deep and uncover a dark and terrible secret which they wish they'd never learned. Although this concept is a theme throughout the set, it's executed most clearly on the card Daring Sleuth, which transforms into Bearer of the Overwhelming Truth. This investigation theme was a great success, a fact demonstrated by the huge demand players have placed on Wizards of the Coast to bring back clue tokens later on. The only weakness of this investigation story is the mystery is sort of ruined by context. We'd just seen the Eldrazi in the previous set, so when we see Fraben Inspector looking at a mysterious mass of tendrils, or grotesque mutation warping somebody's hand into a mouth, or magnifying glass zooming in on someone growing a menacing eye on their shoulder, we've seen enough Eldrazi strangeness in Battle for Zendikar to know who's responsible. Speaking of magnifying glass though, its flavour text perfectly captures the feel which Shadows Over Innistrad was going for. Knight Inquisitors of St. Raban delve deep into mysteries best left unsolved. In Shadows Over Innistrad, the players are delving deep, gathering clues, and attempting to figure out what's going on Magic's spookiest plane. It's only when we get to Eldritch Moon that Emrakul emerges from the shadows, and the Eldrazi take their place as the main antagonists of the block. There are 29 Eldrazi within the set, a number significant enough to show they're twisting Innistrad into their own image, but not so large they appear mundane and everyday. Additionally, every single one of them is colourless, preserving their identity as unknowable alien monstrosities, and many of them are the reverse side of other creatures, who are horribly mutated into a twisted new form. The Eldrazi are perfectly executed as Lovecraftian monstrosities, due to the two mechanics the set uses to represent them: Emerge and Meld. Emerge is a mechanic which allows an Eldrazi to enter the battlefield for a reduced casting cost, if another creature is sacrificed as it comes into play. Not only does this perfectly convey the horror trope of the Eldrazi emerging from the rotting husk of a host whose body they've been possessing, it also gets around the balance issues of having so many expensive colourless cards in a set, something necessary to accurately accommodate the Eldrazi. Every Eldrazi with Emerge can either be cast for a very expensive regular cost, or a significantly reduced Emerge cost, which uses coloured mana. This fixed issues which would otherwise have been present in Eldritch Moon's draft format, wherein every Eldrazi could simply be slotted into every single deck due to their colourless nature. It also presents a workaround which was more mechanically impactful and narratively interesting than Devoid, which it sort of replaced. Meld, meanwhile, is a mechanic which is utterly unique in Magic the Gathering's history. Every card with Meld is paired with another card, also with Meld. If both of them are in play together, they can be merged. The cards flip over and transform, becoming a single entity. Although only 6 cards within the set possess it, and, with the exception of Graph Rats and Midnight Scavenger, it's very difficult to pull off in Limited, Meld is fantastically flavourful. The notion of 2 separate beings being forcefully and uncomfortably merged together is used throughout Lovecraft's works. The idea is even played for very bleak comedy, with the combination of Hanvir Garrison and Hanvir Battlements, who merge to form Hanvir the Riving Township. The flavour text of Hanvir Garrison naively declares, "We're ready for anything," before they're forcefully merged with the town they're protecting into a grotesque monstrosity. Now I know what you may be thinking. How can Shadows Over Innistrad be a proper Lovecraftian horror story, given that the protagonists win? At the conclusion of Eldritch Moon, the Gatewatch, with the help of Tameo, triumph, and seal Emrakul, the leader of the Eldrazi brood on Innistrad and the source of the plane's corruption, within the moon. But when talking to Tameo after their victory, she drops the following bombshell.
Just shut up, Jace! Listen, just listen. It wasn't me. She took me over. Do you understand? It was not me. I was there, in my body, helpless as she came in and took over. My eyes, my hands, my voice. She took them all over. They were not mine.
It's clear then that Emrakul was sealed within the moon not because she was outwitted and outmatched by the protagonists, but because she chose to be sealed away for some unknown purpose. This is fantastic Lovecraftian storytelling. This was as dark an ending as Wizards of the Coast were able to provide to the set, considering that the protagonist needed to stay alive in order to appear again in the future. The story ends on a bleak and hopeless note, as we're left to ponder what possible reason Emrakul could have for sealing herself within the moon, and what her ultimate plan is. So to bring everything together, the Eldrazi were introduced in Rise of the Eldrazi as Magic the Gathering's take on Lovecraftian horror. A genre defined by its use of antagonists who are unknowably powerful cosmic entities that drive their opponents to madness through the inscrutable danger which they represent. Battle For Zendikar block failed to adequately live up to the legacy of Rise of the Eldrazi. It placed them as antagonists in a war story, a genre which did not suit them, and presented their mechanical identity in a flavourful, but arguably underpowered way, and ended on far too happy a note to truly utilise their Lovecraftian nature properly. Shadows Over Innistrad block, meanwhile, iterated and expanded upon everything which Rise of the Eldrazi had started. Magic the Gathering's horror plane was the ideal venue to feature its most horrifying creatures, and Wizards of the Coast pulled out all the stops to execute the tropes of Lovecraftian horror. Emerge and Meld were both great successes at conveying the Eldrazi's horrifying nature, and the set's story presented a bleak and hopeless tone, similar to Lovecraft's works. I'll end this video with the ending words of Eldritch Moon's story. As Jace sits back and remembers his encounter with Emrakul, he takes a moment to pause and think.
Jace sat for a longer time still. He looked again at the moon in its silver luminescence, the glyphs still brightly inscribed on its surface, a testament to what the Gatewatch had achieved. His spine was cold. It is not my time. Not yet. He dropped his gaze from the moon and went in search of a safe bed to find temporary oblivion.